This is the Cutty Sark, one of the most important and wonderful ships in the world. It is the fastest sail-powered cargo ship ever built. To find out all about it, I've come aboard and I'm going to meet two guys from Lloyd's Register, which is one of the best archives of ships and shipbuilding in the world. Max Wilson and Zach Schieferstein have spent years delving into the Lloyd's Register Foundation's unique collection of maritime history, which provides a fascinating insight into the world of shipping and trade that made up the foundations of the British Empire. We'll discuss what the archives tell us about Britannia's rule over the waves, how such a detailed register of vessels helped facilitate its maritime strength, and how one clipper ship gained eternal fame. Max, in the 19th century, we all focus on the big red blotches on the map of the British Empire, but actually Britain's trading extended way beyond that, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's worth making the point that by the time Queen Victoria ascends to the throne, the British Empire is already about 2 million square miles. It governs 100 million people. By the time of her death in 1901, it's about 12 million square miles, and it's governing about 370 million. So it's grown hugely over this period. And so over the course of the 19th century, the Victorians are enjoying all these new products for the first time, and it's trade and commerce that are driving the empire. So they're enjoying tea from China and India, it's coffee from the Middle East and the East, it's spices from the Southeast, textiles from Egypt, timber from Canada, frozen meat from Australia and New Zealand, sugar from the Caribbean. And all of these things are being brought to Britain as raw commodities from these colonies. They're being used to make things in the manufacturing heartland of Britain. And as a result, all of these products are then made available to the colonies to be purchased either directly through or from Britain itself. And at this point, Britain is regarded as the workshop of the world. So it has this major industrial and manufacturing heartland. And over the 19th century, you see this grow into things like mechanical engineering, ceramics, textiles, printed material, and a number of other luxury goods as well. And so all of these lucrative trades are being underpinned by Britain's powerful merchant fleet, which is delivering all of these goods.
And who's protecting that merchant fleet? Because there are dangers on the high seas.
So the merchant fleet is being protected chiefly by its very skilled, well-funded, powerful Royal Navy, which exists from 1805 and Britain's victory in the Battle of Trafalgar, largely unchallenged in the world. And it's this Royal Navy that is really Britain's force in the world on the high seas, protecting that merchant fleet and these shipping lanes.
British merchant vessels may have had the comfort of Royal Navy protection, but they could not afford any complacency, especially when it came to speed and efficiency. Fleets across the globe were forever competing to dominate trade and commodities, using whatever tools and techniques available to modify their ships.
To maintain their edge, shipbuilders and architects are having to pioneer and innovate new technologies and techniques of shipbuilding. And we see this starkly over the 19th century. There are a number of quite key big developments, and the reasons behind this are to maximise the speed of cargo delivery, it's to harness the cargo carrying capacity of these ships, to bolster the safety of passengers and goods, and to increase the number of journeys, because the empire is growing. There's a need to control it, and there's a need to increase Britain's share of the global merchant trade. And so really over this period we start to see a number of really big changes in shipbuilding. We see the move from the south to the north in terms of geography of the shipyards, in places like the Humber, the Mersey, the Tyne, the Clyde. And we see the transformation of shipbuilding as being regarded more as a craft to where it is today as an engineering and technical science, which is unsurprising obviously for an island nation that's making its living by the sea. So it's, obviously this is reflected by things like the creation in 1860 of the Royal Institute of Naval Architects, as we know today. But obviously it's the two major developments are fuel and materials. So fuel in terms of the transition from sail to steam to diesel, and in terms of materials from wood to iron to composite to steel. And to give an idea of, I suppose, the rough idea of this change, when we're talking about fuel, in 1840, steamships make up just about 4% of Britain's overall merchant fleet. By about 1870, so just 1 year after the Cutty Sark is launched, steamships are about 20%. And then by 1890, steamships make up nearly sort of 3/4, 75%.
Zach, Max has told us it's the coming of steam, the dawn of the era of steam. Why are they building a massive sailing ship in 1869?
Well, the sailing ships were still very reliable at that time, and the reliability of the steamships wasn't sort of tested as of yet. And ships like the Cutty Sark that were built for a purpose of transporting tea, they were built for the speed of travelling long distances, getting the first tea of the season ready to sell for those high premiums.
Give me the stats. How fast?
So the fastest recorded speed was about 17.5 knots, which is about 20 miles an hour. Doesn't sound too fast, but for the time, incredibly fast.
For a big container ship at the time, that's insane.
Yeah. And the furthest she travelled in a 24-hour period was roughly 350, 360 nautical miles in a day, which again is impressive. And it wasn't uncommon to make the journey from Shanghai to ports in Britain in about 100 to 120 days. And again, doesn't seem like it's that quick, but for the time it was really setting records.
Record breaking.
Yeah.
And not that many crew on board.
No, relatively small crew considering. I mean, this changed depending on the journey, the trade, who was owning it and where it was going, but an average number is about 26 crewmen.
Given that people might know HMS Victory, a big naval, that had something like 800 men on board, so we get a sense of just how few people this ship was designed to be sailed by.
Yeah, and again, that changed over time when they sort of changed the mast at one time to make it easier to have less crew. And we know that when it was under the British flag, there was about 650 people served on it throughout its entire lifetime, which, when you compare that to massive war steamers and naval ships, is really small.
Was she bigger than what had come before?
Yeah, I mean, for the type of ship she was, had a gross tonnage of about 963, length of 212.5, breadth of 36 feet and a depth of 21 feet. So it was a substantial size vessel.
As impressive as she may have looked, Cutty Sark was only a tiny cog in the enormous machine that was the shipping industry. The trade in goods itself was also only part of the equation, with a plethora of interconnected services thriving as a result of Britain's worldwide commercial success. Zach, I think what's so interesting about Britain's sort of period of naval domination is, yes, it's ships at sea, yes, it's trade, but there's a kind of explosion of activity here in London as well. It becomes the centre of all these service industries, whether it's surveying and insurance and legal affairs, and actually that legacy endures to this day.
Yeah, it does. So in the 1680s, have a coffee shop owned by a man called Edward Lloyd's, and ship owners, shipbuilders, underwriters, a lot of people in the maritime industries would meet in this coffee shop, have a coffee, talk about business. Edward Lloyd started to sort of, build on this, and he published a newspaper, which eventually became Lloyd's List, and then from that you have the birth of the Society for the Register of Shipping, which is what Lloyd's Register is, basically.
So it's just keeping track of all the shipping movements?
Yes, so it was sort of born out of this desire to have reliable and up-to-date information on merchant shipping, and sort of to make it safer as well. So for people wanting for passengers, for cargo and for the crew, making sure they had a safe, reliable vessel was sort of paramount, really. And the role of the surveyors within Lloyd's Register was to make an assessment of a ship, a bit like an MOT for a car, is sort of the easiest way, to explain it. They'd have a preset, defined rules for sort of categorising how good the ship was, and it was the first classification society. And they would grade the ship, and it's changed a lot over the time. But at the time we're looking at for the Cutty Sark, A1 was the sort of best grade, best classification a ship could get. And over the years that's been used to sort of for anything of good quality. But essentially it would be A, E, I, O and U for the hull of the ship, and then 1, 2 and 3 for the outrigging, the masts and all of that.
I guess this is just all about building a culture of transparency, of sort of dispassionate regulation, so that investors and people that want to transport stuff can have some confidence in the vessels that they're using.
Yeah, and that's exactly what the register book was. I mean, it was a list of all of these ships with this classification. It would record who built it, where it was built, particulars about the tonnage, later on about the engines as well. Sometimes it would list where they're going and the port they were surveyed. So it was really just like a catalogue of who's who of ships and shipbuilders.
So Zach, with so many different ships being built and journeys being made, and as we all know, you need different ships, different jobs and different tonnages and different sail configurations. So Lloyd is kind of stepping back and giving an objective view of the entire industry.
Yes, yeah, and sort of how they do this is through the surveyors themselves. So they're initially between the age of 30 to 50, based at major ports throughout the UK. You think of places like Belfast, Glasgow, Liverpool, obviously London, Sunderland, Hull. And they would go up to the ship owners, ask them if they want their ship surveyed, which at the beginning was a bit of a hard sell, trying to say, we're going to charge you to inspect this vessel. Some people didn't see why there would be a use for that. But as time went on, people realised that the safer a ship was, the more reliable it was, the more people would be willing to go on it as a passenger, and the more the sort of insurance premiums would be lower as well. So it was really these surveyors that were out in the field doing this job. It was a dangerous job, still is a dangerous job today. People are still out there surveying ships. But they were sort of organised really by the head office in London. So you had lots of committees. Lloyd's Register has loved committees over its 250-year history. But the General Committee is the core kind of organisation of Lloyd's Register.
I love that, because unlike other parts of the world where you could probably bribe dodgy officials and stuff, this is them saying, if we give an A1 rating to that ship, it's good to go. And then you can see them people incorporate that into advertising material and saying, we got A1 from Lloyd's.
Yeah, and it's funny you should mention the bribing, because that was a real concern. If you had, say, a surveyor in the Clyde, but the main office is London, that is a fair distance in the 1840s and 50s to try and sort of control what they're doing. And we have this story of the first principal surveyor, George Bailey, threw somebody overboard when they were trying to bribe him. And that's sort of the kind of diligent sort of work that Lloyd's Register sort of wanted the surveyors to have. But one way that they sort of tried to control this was by having what they called the visitation committee. So the chief surveyor, the chairman and chief staff would go to these different outports and just inspect the work, look at the shipyards, and just see how they were operating. And it's funny enough as well that John Whitehat Willis, who was the owner of the Cutty Sark, was on the classification committee of Lloyd's Register. So they had a lot of people in the maritime business and trade sort of within these committees and this work.
So Cutty Sark gets A1. Initially China trade, as we talked about, so it's taking tea back from China. Also the world trade to Australia. It held the record between Australia and the UK for a while. Where else is it trading?
Well, it depends on, again, what the trade was. As you said, China mainly going from like Shanghai to some ports in Britain. The world trade was largely Australia, New South Wales, Victoria and Sydney, again going to ports in Britain. But when she's sold in 1895 to a Portuguese shipbuilding company named Ferreira, she starts servicing trade in the Portuguese colonies, or what was then the Portuguese colonies. So really you start to see a bit more of a global activity, going from places in South Africa, North Africa, South America, and then to Portugal and to Britain.
She's been everywhere.
Yeah.
She's well travelled. Helping her rack up thousands of nautical miles on the high seas were 32 sails, capable of stretching across 32,000 square feet, suspended on 11 miles of rigging. Time was very much the essence, especially when it came to the trade in a commodity that's now become synonymous with the country of her origin. What is it with the Brits and tea? Why do we need tea so fast from China? What's going on there, Max?
So it's ironic that now the drink which is synonymous with Britain and Britishness has actually very little that's native about it at all. So the Dutch and the Portuguese bring tea to Europe, and it makes its way eventually into the London coffee houses in about the 1650s or so. Samuel Pepys becomes the very first recorded Briton to document his tea drinking experience. We don't know what he actually thought about it. We don't know much about what the quality was like either. But in 1662, there's a sort of a landmark moment with tea drinking in Britain, and this is the marriage of Charles II to his wife Queen Catherine of Braganza, and she helps to popularise tea drinking amongst the British nobility and at court. But it's interesting, really, because it's obviously at this point very highly taxed. It's the East India Company holds this this stranglehold, this monopoly on tea from 1669 onwards. And so largely it's confined to the upper echelons of society, but it becomes something that is widely democratised through smuggling over the course of the 17th and into the 18th century. And it's thought that this really democratises tea drinking among the masses, so much so that it's thought that the illicit trade outnumbers the legal trade, and this leads the Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger to slash the tax on tea in 1783, which finally makes it more affordable for the masses. And the other thing, of course, by the time we get to the Victorian period, there's this huge influx of sort of temperance movements and religious reform and social reform, which is aimed at really trying to dispel and move these large industrial working class communities away from things like alcohol. And tea is seen as the answer to try to switch people away from beer. As it's sort of marketed for men and for women, as opposed to coffee, which is marketed at this time just for men. And so tea is really put forward by these leaders, for the idea of creating like a flourishing, working, industrial community, because it's healthy and it's sweet and it's energizing. And over this period, it becomes, really, really well known, and a commonplace and essential item. And of course, by the time we get to the Cutty Sark, more widely, the East India Company's monopoly ends in 1834. Free trade reigns in 1849, and from the 1850s we start to see China's plantations coming under competition from new plantations that are being set up in Calcutta, modern-day Kolkata, where it's exempt from tax, and from Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka. Where these plantations radically alter their localities, and they provide work for the surrounding areas. But they also see a lot of people working under harsh conditions and very poor pay, and so all of this becomes synonymous and forms a backdrop to the emergence of tea as the national drink, and the tea races, of which Cutty Sark becomes known.
The annual tea race was a Victorian sensation. With a premium or bonus paid to the ship that arrived with the first tea of the year, clipper ships, including Cutty Sark, would race from China's tea ports to London to fetch the highest price for its cargo. In 1866, in what became known as the Great Tea Race, the ship's progress was reported by telegraph and could be followed in the papers, with huge bets being laid on the outcome. With such a famous trade occurring between Britain and China, it was important for Lloyd's to also have a presence in the East. Zach, you mentioned there were Lloyd's Register people sort of monitoring ships, serving ships all over Britain. Did they go overseas as well?
Yeah, they did. The first appointment we know of for an exclusive surveyor who was only doing work for Lloyd's Register was in Canada, sort of appointed in the 1850s, 1851, and this sort of continued over time. And, as Max has spoken about the tea trade in China, we have the first appointment of a surveyor in China in 1869, the same year that the Cutty Sark is built. And he's not too far away from one of the biggest shipyards in Shanghai. In 1870, we know that he writes to this general committee to say that he's really sort of anticipating the work that will need to be sort of improved and more offices opened, and that he sort of sees that China will become this hub for industrialisation.
Huge if true.
Yeah, but he's really sort of 100 years ahead of the mark, really. But Lloyd's Register does have more offices open in China. By 1930, there's about 10 offices. There's a national committee in 2002, and then they also help in the sort of 1950s, 60s and 70s with a little bit of sort of guidance with the Chinese Register of Ships. But they are now one of the biggest, if not the biggest, sort of shipbuilder in the world.
Max, they were taking tea out of China. What was being sent into China? What's the trade?
So it tends to be luxury goods. It's worth making the point that with the tea trade, obviously the British Empire at this point is on the rise, but it's worth making the point that this trade is being done often on unequal terms. It's often being done at the expense of indigenous peoples and localities. And China is a really prime example of how the imperial trade impacts and is forced on countries. So China, for example, for many years holds this monopoly on tea, silk, porcelain, and for a long time they're actually not interested in Western goods at all, and they're trading only in silver. But you can't really talk about the tea trade without talking about the other major trade which comes to tragically alter China's relationship with Europe and the West, and that's opium, which forms a long-standing scourge, which has really direct consequences for Chinese economic and social life. So opium is grown in India. It's then sold and traded illegally in China. Despite it being illegal, the Qing emperor and his government try to regulate and control this trade and to curb it. All of this leads in 1839 to the destruction of really large-scale opium stocks that are held in British warehouses in China. And ultimately this leads to the first Opium War, which is concluded with a British victory in 1842, and essentially sees European settlers, traders and merchants given special rights within designated treaty ports.
So you're prizing open the Chinese market, forcing them to take our trade.
Absolutely, and it's, this treaty, the Treaty of Nanking, is regarded as the first of the unequal treaties. And so eventually there are further clashes between the government and the Europeans, and this leads to the Second Opium War, with Britain and France on one side, China on the other. And again, it results in the sort of supremacy of the Western forces, which inflict heavy war reparations. They expand these rights, they open more treaty ports, and they legalise the opium trade. And so even though you have this really fierce Chinese resistance to this, it's actually quite a brutal campaign that sees large loss of life, the subjugation of Chinese law and sovereignty, the loss of territories, and the ransacking and destruction of Chinese cultural sites and artefacts.
So Cutty Sark is riding in a way off the back of that. It's going and trading with China through ports sort of prized open by British and French military action.
Absolutely, absolutely, and this forms the backdrop to the tea trade, of which is becoming so popular in Britain.
Zach, what about the later years when steamships were snapping at the heels of these sailing beauties? What Cutty Sark continued to have quite a long life.
Yeah, she did. In the war trade, it was still setting records for delivering wool at the fastest sort of times. But I think what's really important to talk about here is the opening of the Suez Canal, 1869, again, sort of the year that the Cutty Sark's built. That really sort of cuts down the time for steamships travelling from these eastern ports, taking goods to the west. Whereas I said earlier it would take about 100 to 120 days for the Cutty Sark, it could take a steamship going through the Suez Canal 60 days.
Why can't Cutty Sark go through the Suez Canal?
Well, there's just different taxes on what vessels can go through and the price of it, and I think that people with the steamers are able to afford these prices because these are larger vessels that can carry more cargo, there's more money there, and even at first they're not seen as more reliable, and some people wrongly think that an iron hull will damage goods. The steamships just, again, become more reliable over time and getting bigger and bigger in tonnage and transporting more goods.
And the winds in the Red Sea are a nightmare as well. Yeah, poor old sailing ships. Now, you mentioned it was in Portuguese hands for a while. It comes back to Britain, does it?
Yes, so it's sold to the Portuguese in 1895. As I said, serves trade going around the Portuguese colonies at the time. It survives the First World War, narrowly avoiding a few scrapes and also narrowly avoiding the fate of its one-time sort of competitor clipper ship, the Thermopylae, which is bombed at one point. So after this, which is the last surviving clipper in the world, is surveyed again by a Lloyd Register staff, this time by Charles H. Jordan, who is brought out of retirement to survey the ship because he's one of few people who still understands the skills and techniques needed for a sailing ship. And then is purchased by a retired merchant naval captain, Wilfred Dowman. Him and his wife purchase the ship when they see it in port in Falmouth. And he sort of opens it a bit to the public, restores it, sees it go back to its original glory and beauty, but he sadly passes away in 1936. And then it is used as a naval training vessel for the Thames Nautical Training College, alongside some other vessels during the World War II as well. So these young naval officers are able to train on board and sort of get an understanding of what it means to work on and use a 19th century sailing ship. And this is where we come to, I guess, in our eyes, the modern period. The Cutty Sark is brought into a dry dock in 1953. The Cutty Sark Preservation Society, which is formed in sort of 1951 by the then director of the National Maritime Museum, Frank Carr, with a lot of support from the Duke of Edinburgh and other people who are interested in preserving the ship. Bring her into dry dock, preserve her, surveyed again by Lloyd's Register, this time for free, and is sort of made to be this historical monument ship. One of only 3 composite ships left in the world, and yeah, is here where we are today.
The incredible efforts to preserve Cutty Sark's history make it one of the nation's most treasured heritage sites. And with new documents and records, such as those collated by the Lloyd's Register Foundation, the story of this remarkable clipper ship gets ever richer. The story of the Cutty Sark looms so large in the Lloyd's Register archive. What makes your archive just so fabulous if you're interested in this period, if you're interested in our maritime? In fact, generally if you're interested in the past.
Well, they've got a really unique collection of records relating to maritime history. For ships like the Cutty Sark, especially, we have a series of records of the survey reports with plans and correspondence and other documents. About over 1 million of these, covering about 94,000 ships. So if you're interested in that history of shipbuilding and the technological developments with that, it provides a really good sort of window into that history. But alongside this maritime history, there's also records that we have that relate to other UK classification societies. There's work that was done with aviation, with the yacht building, steel testing, engineering in general. And we have records relating to all of these sort of fabulous areas of history.
Yeah, I love it because you think of how that impacts all these other parts of history. Every person who emigrated to the New World from Europe would have been on a ship which had the once over from your Lloyd's Register surveyors.
Yeah, if they weren't classified, they were at least listed in the ship in the register. It was known as the Shipping Bible. We have all of these sort of documents, and a lot of them are digitised and freely available. As an organisation, we're in quite a unique position to be able to sort of do these sorts of things, of digitise mass amounts of material, and to be able to fund research into lots of different areas. We've been focused on safety at life at sea since 1760, and we're sort of committed to doing that today.
Zach and Max, thank you very much. Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.